Hi everyone, welcome to Yuhan's channel. Here we explore China in a deep and unique angle. Today we are going to talk about how difficult it can be to be a girl in China and whether there is still hope for girls to overcome these hardships. As many know, China, a country long dominated by Confucian ideology, was historically deeply patriarchal. The culture emphasized the complete loyalty to the family, with principles like male superiority and female inferiority, and a strong preference for sons. Even today, many legacies of these beliefs remain. Though gender equality was written into the constitution from the very founding of the People's Republic of China, and everybody knows there is a very communist style, famous slogan, women hold up half the sky. Personally, I didn't strongly feel discrimination growing up. Maybe I was lucky, or maybe I wasn't sensitive or critical enough to notice the subtle signs. I just overlooked them. I genuinely assumed gender equality in Chinese society was fairly okay. But in recent years, some mind blowing news on the topic has made me doubt my own naivety. I'm not very news savvy, so I miss most headlines. The ones I do notice might be coincidental, but more likely they were simply too big to ignore. For example, a rather absurd online debate took place in 2022 over whether sanitary pads should be sold on high speed trains. It started simply enough. A girl posted online complaining that she couldn't find pads on the train and suggested they should be available for purchase. Somehow, this triggered a strong backlash from many male influencers. They argued that sanitary products are special items and selling them on trains would be immoral. They claimed that women should prepare these items themselves. Why should society, as they put it, pay for their own mistakes? For me, it is really hilarious. So, in the 21st century, menstruation is still viewed by some as somehow immoral. Fortunately, this debate had a positive outcome. Today, most high speed trains in China now sell sanitary pads, and some even provide them for free. Anyway, this is already a huge progress. But there are also plenty sad stories. Last year, a case in my city gained nationwide attention. A girl married for just 2 years had suffered domestic violence 11 times, leaving her with multiple internal injuries and requiring a permanent colostomy bag. Throughout those 2 years, she repeatedly reported the abuse to the police, but they neither arrested her husband nor took compulsory measures. She filed for divorce multiple times, yet the court never granted it. Only after she shared her story online, sparking public outrage, was her husband finally sentenced to 11 years in prison, a punishment many still consider too lenient. While domestic violence can affect anyone, in China it occurs in roughly 30% of families, with about 90% of the victims being women. I sometimes watch relationship mediation shows for pastime, and I recall one episode where a woman described being tyrannically abused by her husband for decades and wanted a divorce. Though her physical injuries weren't as severe as in the previous case, the abuse was openly discussed on TV. Though the mediators were condemning the husband, they ultimately just made him promise not to be violent again and persuaded the woman to stay in the marriage. Somehow, it seems domestic violence, though acknowledged as wrong and illegal, is often treated as normal and forgivable. What remains paramount is maintaining family harmony, no matter how superficial, a priority that hasn't changed for millennia. And women, it seems, are still expected to endure. According to a study I came across, a survey of around 400 people revealed that 80% believe gender equality has not yet been achieved. In a nutshell, according to these cases and the data, we could say that Chinese women remain in a vulnerable position, yet they exhibit remarkable resilience. Perhaps this endurance has been carved into the bones of Chinese women. We have had to compromise within this patriarchal society, repressing ourselves in order to survive across generations. About a century ago, one of China's most famous female writers, Zhang Ailin, described a normal scene in one of her stories. I saw a rather decently dressed man, unarguably from the gang class, the respectable gentry, beating a woman. They came struggling all the way down the street. Many onlookers, indignant at the sight, shouted to the woman, "Take him to the police station." The woman wept, "I don't want him taken to the police station. I want him to go home." Then she pleaded with the man, go back and beat me." Zhang Ailing was born in 1920 at a time when women's rights were just beginning to be discussed among intellectuals. She belonged to one of the earliest generations with the awareness and opportunity to fight for equality, yet this was still the kind of thing she witnessed in everyday life. It might look like a personal choice by the woman. She couldn't blame others for her own cowardness, but literally there was no other options either. In 1852, the French missionary Évariste Hague observed, "The condition of Chinese women is most miserable, suffering, enduring hardship, and facing discrimination, with all kinds of afflictions and humiliations relentlessly accompanying her from the cradle to the grave. She is treated as a lowly animal, scarcely regarded as a human being." At the time he made that observation during the late Qing dynasty, China's last feudal dynasty, the oppressive customs imposed on girls accumulated over millennia and had reached their peak. A woman faced countless restrictions and prohibitions regarding her own body, marriage, education, and more. She had almost no right to make any choice for herself. Let's break this down. First, a woman's body did not belong to herself. The most notorious example is foot bathing. The admiration for small feet in women has been recorded since at least the 1st century BCE, and one of the most famous references coming from the 11th century poet Su Shi. However, scholars believe that until around that time, it mainly referred to dancers. Although the trend had spread to the general population, it was more like to wearing a certain style of shoe to make the feet appear small and slender, similar to ballet shoes maybe, and that is a choice made by the women themselves. But by the Yuan and Ming dynasties, starting around the 13th century, it evolved into a sexual preference imposed by men, forcing women to conform to their distorted desires. Parents would use long strips of clothes to bind the feet of very young girls, often at 6 or 7 years old maybe, to prevent normal growth. Over time, the bones would break, deforming the feet into an entirely unnatural shape. The process lasted for years and was excruciating, all to achieve the so-called 3-inch golden lotus. Then the girls would be even difficult to walk, hence they were more controllable to their owners. By the 15th and 16th centuries, foot bathing had become a core part of female identity. Even though the Qing government attempted to ban the practice, it continued to spread to the point where the size of a woman's feet became a necessary condition for marriage, a pivotal standard for judging a girl's beauty. Indeed, not only girls have no say over their appearance, they fundamentally did not own their own bodies. As discussed in our previous videos on birth rates, many female infants were historically killed by their own families. Moreover, although slavery was theoretically abolished in China quite early, it remained common, as seen in many films, for poor parents to sell their daughters to brothels or wealthy households. Moreover, although slavery was theoretically abolished in China quite early, it remained common, as seen in many movies, for poor parents to sell their daughters to brothels or wealthy households. Of course, human trafficking was not limited to girls, but unless driven to utter desperation, families rarely gave up their sons. Similarly, husbands could sell their wives or concubines. In such a context, it is not surprising that marriage was arranged entirely by families, treating women as disposable assets rather than individuals with autonomy. The other day, I rewatched Pride and Prejudice. While we might say girls back then were miserable, they had to depend on marriage to survive. But comparing with Chinese girls of the same era, the Bennet sisters actually had a lot of advantages. At least they could appear in public, walk the streets, meet their potential husbands, and could even make their own decisions. For Chinese girls, such freedoms would have been unimaginable. Ideally, a girl born in a good family would never step beyond the inner courtyard. The only men she could see before marriage were her father and brothers. She would not know what her husband looked like until the wedding ceremony was over and they were alone in the bedroom. Engagement could be arranged while the girls were still in their mother's wombs, and marriage often took place at a very young age, like 13 or 14. After marriage, a woman's ownership was formally transferred from her own family to her husband's. For men, marriage was also arranged by their families, and although they could not choose their wives, they were permitted to take concubines, a practice of polygyny that lasted for thousands of years in China. However, the most valued virtue for a woman was fidelity. This was emphasized through countless moral tales, often to an absurd degree. One prominent symbol was the Chastity Arch, a stone memorial gateway erected to honor widows who remained unmarried and chaste for life. Many such arches still exist today. My tutor once collaborated with a Harvard art history professor on a seminal book about them, focusing on a typical arch in Shandong province built in 1829. It commemorates a woman surnamed Wang, who served her father-in-law and mother-in-law for over a decade after her husband's death until her own passing. While villagers still proud of this historical relic, no one knows Mrs. Wang's full personal name. Once married, a woman would adopt her husband's surname, so as the wife of Mr. Ma, she was recorded merely as Ma Wangshi, with Shi being a generic term for clan name. In reality, erecting such an arch was less about honoring the woman and more a display of the husband's family's wealth and political influence. Its construction required permission from the central government, indicating powerful connections, and was costly. Thus, even in a structure theoretically dedicated to freezing a woman, she herself remains invisible. Many such chaste widows were also recorded in local gazettes. Those are often the only ways women could enter official history. Then, in married life, women were expected to be unconditionally obedient to their husbands. We have idioms describe an ideal marriage such as 相敬如宾, treat each other like guests, and 举案齐眉, which literally means the wife presents the male tree held level with her brows. Anyway, emotional connections was considered the least important aspect of a marriage. Furthermore, since filial piety is central to Chinese culture, wives were also required to obey their husband's parents unconditionally, often while living under the same roof. For a woman, the moment she might finally gain some power usually came only after enduring a lifetime of hardship when herself became a mother-in-law. Then she could exercise control over her daughter-in-law, as if compensative psychologically for all she had suffered. This may explain why even today there are so many stories about malicious mother-in-law who mistreat or even abuse their daughters-in-law. Not only that, wives are also expected to produce offspring, ideally sons. Without bearing a male heir, a wife would struggle to gain respect within the family. Unlike in some Christian traditions, divorce was historically permitted in China, but only men held that right. There was a concept known as the seven grounds for divorce, 七出, which allowed a husband to abandon his wife if she failed to meet certain conditions, such as failing to bear a son, being disrespectful to her parents-in-law, showing jealousy, objecting to her husband taking concubines, or having serious illness, and so on. Another staggering fact, in the early 1950s, when the first marriage law was enacted by the CCP, granting women the liberty to choose in marriage for the first time in Chinese history, thousands of women were killed or driven to suicide within just 2 to 3 years simply for seeking to end their marriages, remarry as widows, or go out to work. For instance, one woman who wanted to participate in local government work was beaten to death by her husband and family members, who even dismembered her body. In a tragic way, this reveals just how repressed, controlled, and disparate their lives had been. The data from that period also shows that over 90% of women were illiterate. This is hardly surprising. The girls were traditionally excluded from the formal educational system. A widely held moral principle asserted that a woman's virtue lies in her lack of talent. While some girls, particularly those from better families, did receive some form of education, it was largely confined to lessons on the 3 obedience and 4 virtues. This meant obedience to the father before marriage, obedience to the husband after marriage, and obedience to the son in widowhood. Along with the 4 virtues, moral conduct, proper speech, modest demeanor, and diligent work. Of course, history is never without its exceptions. Even under such oppressive circumstances, there were women of remarkable talent who left behind enduring works of literature and art. China also saw several women who wielded significant political power, with one, Wu Zetian, formally declaring sovereignty and becoming the only officially recognized female emperor in Chinese history. Yet, in general, for thousands of years, women continued to live under such conditions with little substantial change. It was only toward the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, amid broader revolutionary currents sweeping Chinese society, that women's rights and feminism began to enter the vision of Chinese intellectuals. Around 1900, the term feminism first appeared in Chinese media, borrowed, like many other modern concepts, from Japanese. Soon after, works such as Spencer's Social Statics, the subjection of women, were translated into Chinese. Throughout the first half of the 20th century, women's situation improved considerably. At the very least, women began to be recognized as human beings, and society gradually came to understand that marriage should be decided by the couple themselves, not blindly arranged by their families. And they had the possibilities to get some education. Around 1920, girls could enter the universities and there were mixed gender schools. Yet from its earliest stages, Chinese feminism has carried a distinct characteristic. Unlike in the West, where movements were often driven primarily by women themselves, in China it has consistently been woven into broader revolutionary visions and embedded within imaginations of the future nation. There has never been a large-scale Western-style feminist movement in China. Instead, the cause has often been advocated and advanced with the involvement and support of men. The most radical changes indeed came after the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949. Personally, I believe that the advancement of women's rights stands as one of the most significant contributions made by the CCP. The marriage law, enacted as the first law of the new republic, profoundly improved women's vulnerable position in marriage, a matter of life and death for countless women. Alongside this, the Electoral Law of 1953 and the 1954 Constitution explicitly granted women equal rights with men to vote and to stand for election. Today, more than half a century later, while many of the most severe tragedies have ceased, we still witness absurd and unjust situations in everyday life. I may not call myself a feminist, but I do believe feminism remains necessary, though how far the movement should go is a more complex question. As the revered Chinese revolutionary Sun Yat-sen once said, "The revolution is not yet complete. Our comrades must continue the struggles." Alright, this is all for today. Thank you for being here with me and see you next time. Bye.